My name is Jesse Hay. I'll be your presenter this evening. First, I want to give credit where credit is due. I gained these slides and this information from a class that I took at Alpha Omega Institute, and they've been able to allow me to share this information in a context such as this. You are here for the third session that we have, which is Noah's Flood and Geology. Noah's Flood begins being talked about in Genesis chapter 6, that God sent a flood that covered the whole earth. And you may know other details about that flood account. Well, the question is then, once you read that, did it really happen? Or is it just something that was made up? Is it reality or is it fiction? You know, some people might struggle. They might have grown up seeing pictures such as this and thinking, well, how could Noah stick all the animals on that tiny boat? I mean, look, they're overflowing. This doesn't seem like reality. Well, unfortunately, those are not good depictions of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was a very large vessel. God gave commands to Noah for how big to build the ark: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Well, how long is a cubit? Well, it's the length of your middle finger down to your elbow. Well, as you can imagine, depending upon whose arm you're using to measure out for the ark, you'll come to somewhere about 450 to 520 feet long the ark was. That's about 1.5 football fields long. And it had 3 decks within it. So you have 3 of that length inside the ark. This is a large vessel. But if you still have questions about, well, how many animals were on the ark, and how did 8 people take care of all those animals, feeding them, watering them, changing the stalls, there's a book back there on the table. You can glance through it, or you can purchase one for yourself, perhaps online. Noah's Ark, a feasibility study, goes into much more, probably even too much detail about how that might have all been able to work inside the ark. And you could also see perhaps the actual recreation of the ark that they've made. The Ark Encounter would be a wonderful first-person opportunity as well to try to visualize, capitalize what may this have looked like. But thinking about the flood as itself, how can we trust that the biblical account of the flood is genuine? Well, how can we trust that accounts about George Washington are genuine? I mean, were you there to see what George Washington did? Do you have video evidence of it? No? Then why do we believe it? Well, because there's some type of reliable historical documentation that backs it up, right? That we say, oh, okay, based off of this documentation, it seems to point into the reality that this truly happened in history. Do you know that there's historical documentation outside of the Bible for a worldwide flood? Some, such as the Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet, which bears an early description of the biblical flood. There's also some Babylonian documents that describe the same flood, a global flood on the earth. Well, because of some of those documents being dated prior to Moses, who's considered the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, some people have theorized, such as this statement here, since at least 1872, the great flood detailed in Genesis, we have understood, is a descent of earlier flood myths from Mesopotamia. So they take those older documents and say, well, they made it up first, and then the Jewish people copied that flood myth. Well, is that truly or really a proper claim to make upon the Bible, that the Bible borrowed from these other accounts of a worldwide flood? Well, let's look at the Babylonian clay cuneiform tablet, and specifically, how does it describe the ark, the vessel in which people and animals survived on? Well, it's basically the world's largest corsicle, which is basically a giant bowl that's about 250 feet in diameter. Can you imagine floating on a bowl in the middle of a tumultuous ocean? That doesn't seem like a very reliable vessel. But in the book of Genesis, we see that actually for the dimensions given, it's the same ratio that we use today for seafaring vessels. That ratio is able to handle the tumultuous waves that are found or that are engaged in the ocean. And it's interesting that that's in the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrews were not seafaring people. And yet in their account, they have a more accurate and reasonable vessel for such a situation. In the Gilgamesh epic, specifically the 11th tablet, there's actually a flood account in there as well. There's an ark, animals taken on the ark, birds sent out during the flood, the ark landing on a mountain, and sacrifices offered after the ark landed. Well, again, based on dating methods, some have said, oh, well, the Bible borrowed from the Gilgamesh epic. Well, again, let's compare perhaps the ark during the Gilgamesh epic. The ark was actually a cube, 120 cubits on all sides. Once again, can you be floating around in a giant cube out on the ocean and be able to be okay and be sustained? No, that would be a terrible, disastrous design for such a vessel. This writer says, Genesis was written about 1400 BC, while the first Gilgamesh story that references the global flood was written from about 2100 BC. It's probable that both stories derived from the same source, an actual global flood. Is that unreasonable? Actually, if you go around to other cultures around the world, you'll find flood legends. All these different cultures talking about there was a time in history, according to our people group. We know that there was a flood that happened over the entire earth. And so does that mean that one person made it up and all these other cultures decided to copy it? Or is it more reasonable to say such an event happened in history, and after that event, the descendants who survived are now carrying that story with them as the nations are developing and people groups are spreading over the earth? They continue to hold on to this account that happened in human history. Well, how do we know that the Bible is the accurate account? Well, if you look at the Bible, it doesn't start out with a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. No, it's very specific. It's like Noah's ship log that he kept a record of. Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, the fountains of the great deep burst open. Very specific detail, right? And it continues on if you continue to read of these details, these specific dates of the things that were happening during this flood event in history. But it says that Noah was hundreds of years, 600 years. I mean, that's ridiculous, right, to believe that? Well, that's if you assume that the average lifespan currently has always been the same throughout human history. That is not what the scriptures show. After the fall of man, who was made to live forever, we see that mankind was living for hundreds of years. But then after the flood, mankind then started living for shorter and shorter periods of time. Do you know there's actually historical documentation outside the Bible for such a pattern as that? It's called the Sumerian Kings List, which names these kings who reigned for long periods of time. And then a great flood came. And after the flood, the Sumerian kings ruled for much shorter periods of time. Interesting how this outside biblical documentation reflects at least the same pattern of decreased longevity as found in the Bible. Well, once again, worldwide flood, the whole world covered in water. People laugh, that's ridiculous. Why would you ever believe that? Well, and unfortunately that's caused some Christians to believe, well, maybe it was just a local flood, Maybe it was just a local flood that happened. That's more reasonable. We won't get mocked if we say it was just a local flood. Well, why do we have to limit the Bible in such a way? Do you know that, well, first of all, that's not what the Bible describes, right? The Bible doesn't describe a local flood. It describes a worldwide flood. And if you look carefully into the Bible, you'll see that as we'll unpack. But is it unreasonable to believe that the whole world was covered in water at one point? Here's a news article talking about Mars. Giant flood hits Mars long ago. Wow. What's it say? Imagine more than 500 times the volume of water in the Great Lakes being released in a single flood, and you'll have the sense of the scale of this event. The force and volume of the water was enough to carve a valley 6,900 feet deep and 550 miles long within a matter of months. Wow, that's amazing. How big is our Grand Canyon? 6,000 feet deep and 277 miles long. That's a massive canyon, catastrophic flood. And how much water is on Mars now? Not very much. But you look at this and you say, massive flood covered. Pfft, no way. No way a massive flood hit this planet. Really? Here's actually an oceanographer who has an evolutionary time scale, and he says some recent studies suggest that water may have covered the Earth's entire surface for some 200 million years before the continents emerged. It's not unreasonable that our planet that's already covered mostly in water was covered entirely by water at some point. There is evidence for this flood being a worldwide flood and not a local flood. First, even looking at the Bible, why is God commanding Moses to build this massive ship for just a local flood? Couldn't he just herd the animals and people away to escape this flood? Also, the language found inside the Bible, talking about every living thing was blotted out from the face of the ground. All flesh perished from under heaven. Also, why is Noah taking birds on the ark? Can't birds just fly away if it's a local flood? Also, the scriptures say that waters covered the tops of the tallest mountains. If water was covering Mount Hood right now, what would that mean for us? We wouldn't be in a good spot, would we? No, if water is covering the tops of the tallest mountains, it's covering the whole earth, right? The whole earth is covered in water. And interestingly, what do we find on the tops of the tallest mountains? Fossils of sea creatures. There's evidence that mountains were covered by water at some point in history. Also, we're told in Scripture that there was no place for a dove to land. Doves can fly very far. If it was a local flood, it could have easily found a place to land, but not if it was a worldwide flood. Also, we were told that God put the rainbow in the sky as a promise that he would never send another flood like this again. Well, if it was a local flood, has he kept his promise? No, there have been many local floods that have killed both man and animal. But if it was a worldwide flood, you can look at that rainbow and say, you've kept your promise, God. You've never sent another worldwide flood again. Also, the duration of the flood. The flood lasted for over a year. That's not how long local floods normally last. And lastly, there is geological evidence to support a worldwide flood and not a local flood. You know, standing back and looking at something like this, you might be able to say, it sure looks like slow, gradual processes formed something like this. But it's important to look at the details more closely, right? I mean, who's this? Say it louder. Marilyn Monroe? Yeah, it kind of looks like her until you look a little closer and you realize, oh, that's not Marilyn Monroe. That's definitely different. Well, here we got two different lines, those middle lines. Which line is longer? Well, it sure looks like the top line is longer, but if you go closely and take a tape measure, both the lines are the exact same length. Can you buy something like this at the store for your kid? Here's just a nice little cube. Actually, no, you look closely and you realize this is an impossible shape. This is something that cannot exist in reality. Well, again, looking at some of the geological features closely, just like this cliffside, on this cliffside, there's these massive boulders sitting here on this cliffside. Where did those this boulder is the size of a dump truck. How did this huge boulder get here by supposedly slow, gradual processes? Another situation you look at here, you have on this side a different type of rock layers running along here, but then you have this type of rock material wedging its way between them, pushing out the rock layers as it's coming in. Now, how could it do that if those rock layers were rock solid over millions of years? How did this one wedge its way into it like that? Another thing that we can look at is something that happened with this mountain. Does anyone know what mountain this is? Yeah, Mount St. Helens used to be a very beautiful mountain until it took up the bad habit of smoking. And not only was it smoking, but it was forming large craters on the top. And also the mountain was bulging upwards of a few feet a day on the sides, which made scientists realize we need to evacuate, this thing's going to blow. And sure enough, the largest recorded landslide in human history occurred where 1/3 of Mount St. Helens slid off, and it exposed the pressure that was building up inside Mount St. Helens and erupted with such force. I've heard that it's 10,000 the times of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Kawasaki. That's how much force is exploding out of Mount St. Helens during that time. A lot of mountain was lost during that eruption, but a lot of information was gained, such as you look at this cliffside and you see these different layers of material, and look, even some are very fine layers, and you say, oh, slow, gradual processes, millions and millions of years. That's the general understanding of rock layers like this, right? Or even ash deposits like this. But no, this was formed only in moments. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens, all this material, earthen material flying through the air, what goes up must come down. And so that material was coming down, the heavier stuff first, and then lighter and lighter and lighter, coming down in sheets, laying themselves down, even in these fine, very fine layers, only in moments, not in millions of years. If you were to go to the Badlands of South Dakota, these are ash deposits as well that have been eroded. And the standard thought is, well, how long did it take for them to be eroded like this? Millions and millions of years, slow, gradual processes. Well, after Mount St. Helens erupted, it shot off ice and snow that was on top, and when it came down and was buried by the steaming hot ash, it caused these steam blasts after the eruption that formed these geological features, mostly in one day, not in millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years. You may look at a canyon like this and say, oh, how long did it take for that little river to the current erosion rate that it is right now? Let's take that and go back and back and back. How long did it take for it to carve this canyon and subsequent rainfall? Well, that would be a wrong understanding because that canyon didn't exist prior to Mount St. Helens. After all that ash material came down, then there were subsequent water flows that cut through that soft ash layers and left this canyon with that very small river running through it. It was carved very rapidly. And not only is Mount St. Helens evidence of that, but there's geologists are finding evidence for rapid erosion elsewhere, such as National Geographic in 2007. Peter Friends, a monument scientist, said, you'd expect this hard rock canyon to be thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old. But what's it say at the end there? It was cut in less than a decade. Less than a decade, that deep, hard rock canyon? That is very rapid erosion. Because we may not understand the power of water. Enough water moving fast enough can do amazing amount of damage and carve amazing amount of features, which was discovered in an incident that happened with the Glen Canyon Dam, which is in Page, Arizona. It holds back Lake Powell. Well, in 1983, so much rainfall had happened that the water was building up behind the dam faster than they could release it through their normal channels, even though they had them all open. And so they were worried that the dam was going to fail, the water was going to go over it. So they decided to open up the spillways. The spillways are what they used to divert the river while they were building the dam. Usually you don't use it after you're done building the dam. You don't continue to have water going out the spillways. So they decided to open up the spillways to try to get more water going out. And they opened them full blast. And not too long afterwards, they started to notice out of one of the spillways, chunks of rock were coming out. And then the water was turning red. Why is the water turning red? Well, what's the canyon made out of? Red sandstone. They realized, oh no, the water has cut through the sides of the pipe and is now eating into the side of the canyon, and it could make the dam fail if we don't shut it off. So they shut it off and they went inside and they saw that the water had cut through 4 feet of steel reinforced concrete and had carved a hole, a basketball court-sized hole 40 feet down into the canyon side. And why did this happen? Because of cavitation. Cavitation, when water is flowing rapidly enough and it hits an uneven surface, it creates a vacuum that then once it's broken, it's like a shock wave that sends out into that material nearby. Well, as it continues to send out those shock waves like a jackhammer, it's making that unevenness even worse and worse as it's breaking off material, and the cavitation is getting deeper and deeper and more destructive as the water is flowing over an uneven surface. It's continuing to pulverize whatever is in its path because so much water is moving so fast. Well, a similar feature happened for what you see forming here. You look at this canyon, and again, you might assume, well, how long did it take for that river to slowly carve out this canyon and subsequent rainfall? Well, actually, geologists now say that this canyon was carved by the Missoula flood. The Missoula flood, if you go to Missoula, Montana, and look along the hillsides, you'll see these little lines running along some of the hillsides. You might wonder, what are those lines there for? They're not man-made. What it is that there was actually a lake that built up over Missoula, Montana. And as it was building up, it was etching its way into the hillsides. Because what happened is that during the Ice Age, the ice was coming down and it cut off a river that was a way for the water runoff to flow through. It cut off that source of flowing out and created this dam that then slowly built up this massive lake, ancient Lake Missoula. That was upwards of 900 feet deep over Missoula, 2,000 feet deep at the dam itself near Sandpoint, Idaho. Well, as you can imagine, building a dam out of ice is not very smart because eventually the dam failed. And when the dam fails, what's that water going to do? It's going to go to the lowest point, right? It says, I'm heading to the ocean. And how much water are we talking about? Over 500 cubic miles of water moving towards the ocean. That's greater than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. All that water saying, we are now leaving and we're heading towards the ocean. And as it's moving so much water so fast, it is completely pulverizing things that are in its path. And as it's going over uneven surfaces, that cavitation process, including even waterfalls in general, and waterfalls are flowing over, they're not only eroding forwards, but they're also eroding backwards. And so for this underwater waterfall that's going through, as it's going over an uneven surface, it's undercutting itself, like that picture you might see down there, if you can see it well enough. It undercuts, and then the top of the waterfall then fails, and it falls down, and the waterfall moves back. And it erodes underneath itself until the top fails, and the waterfall moves back, and it keeps digging its way backwards until it eventually runs out of steam. How much water are we talking about? They estimate that the rate of flow of the Missoula flood was 10 times the flow of all rivers in the world combined. So you take the flow rate of all the rivers in the world, you put them together, you multiply it by 10, and that's the flow rate of this water shooting across Washington, heading towards the coast. Massive amount of power eroding. And there I am at Dry Falls, Washington, where this waterfall used to be. And now it's Dry Falls because it used to have this massive amount of water spilling over and carving out this area until eventually it ran out of steam. And now you have Dry Falls because the water is no longer flowing over it. But this was a massive area being carved. Dry Falls is 3.5 miles wide, has a 400-foot drop. Compare that to Niagara Falls, which is 1 mile wide and a 150-foot drop. This is a massive amount of water eroding such a feature. And if you then go from Dry Falls heading down the canyon, that's what you see here. And all this, geologists will say, were carved in 24 to 48 hours. Look at this canyon, over 400 feet deep, carved in 24 to 48 hours. Massive erosion. Another evidence for such catastrophic flooding is what's called erratic boulders. Here's a boulder. It's different than the material it's sitting on, and you can look out. It's a pretty flat field. If you were to turn the camera around, flat field as well. Well, where did this boulder come from? It didn't fall off of a mountain or anything. Well, again, that's evidence that there was some catastrophic amount of water that plucked up that boulder from somewhere, and then as it then spread out over this field here, it lost its momentum and then dropped some of its load, such as this boulder, as it was spreading out across this area. And you'll see other erratic boulders spread around, such as also in the area of the Snake River Plain near Twin Falls, Idaho. These erratic boulders that are actually waterborne, you see how they're kind of rounded on the edge, as if they've been tumbling around in a river for a little while? You'll find these scattered across, again, fields. There's no cliffs and mountains nearby. Where did these boulders come from? Some of them are the size of cars. Well, once again, there was another flood that geologists have understood, which is called the Bonneville flood, ancient Lake Bonneville. 22,000 square miles of water, about 9,000 or 1,000 feet deep above the Great Salt Lake. And there again is a line you can see etched into the hillside of where this lake used to be, and it was cutting into the sides of the hills. Here's a map of what they believe Lake Bonneville looked like. That they believe that there was a landslide that cut off a river, and then the lake built up behind that earth dam until the earth dam failed, and then all that water is seeking to shoot down to the lowest point, which would be the ocean. And a massive amount of flooding. Here's a plaque that talks about the Bonneville flood. During its peak, the flow of the Bonneville flood through the canyon reached 33 million cubic feet per second. That's equivalent to the volume of 374 Olympic-sized pools flowing by every second. Huge amount of water, catastrophic damage, cutting through, carving canyons like this, 500 feet deep, 50 miles long, cut in a matter of days because of massive flooding, the power of water. Once again, looking closely here, we see these nice little waterfalls, but look at the water all around. How did all this get eroded out if all you have is these little waterfalls? Well, that shows evidence that there used to be a lot more water flowing over it, right? That there was water that carved out this canyon and this waterfall, but then slowed down here and ran out of momentum, and now you just have these little waterfalls left over afterwards. But there's evidence that there was much more water at some point that carved these features that you see. And even above the Snake River is where you'll find those erratic boulders, which shows it wasn't just the water shooting in this canyon, but it was even even flowing over the sides of the canyon, upwards of 50 feet higher than the rim, and then depositing some of the material that it was eroding or it was cutting through, being deposited there on the open fields as it was losing momentum. Not just in America is there evidence for such catastrophic erosion, massive flooding. In Siberia, there's one that was reported to be 100 times the flow of all rivers combined. Here's Wave Rock in Australia. It runs for 7 miles. Seems to also be evidence of some rapid erosion, massive amount of water flowing at one point. You see, time is not the hero of the plot. It's the conditions that are more important. If the conditions are right, you don't need so much time in order to produce the geological features that we see around us. If we look closely at the details, we'll see that there's evidence for what it truly is and not what we assume it to be. And when we look out at the Earth's surface, there is evidence for a massive amount of water carving out features of the Earth, just like the scriptures talk about a massive amount of water that covered the Earth at one point. You look at something like the Grand Canyon, standard interpretation of how did the Grand Canyon get formed? Millions of years of gradual erosion, right? Slow, gradual processes. Well, yes, a little amount of water over a long period of time perhaps could have carved this, but could it also be possible that a lot of water over a little amount of time could have carved the Grand Canyon? We've seen other canyons be carved rapidly with a lot of water. There's actually some scientists who believe that there were other ancient lakes backed up behind the Grand Canyon, that there seems to be evidence that some of those could have existed and that whatever was blocking them up failed and then flowed through the Grand Canyon, carving it out in a matter of days. Again, those boulders we were looking at before, the size of dump trucks, we find them down towards the end of the Grand Canyon. How did they get there unless there was a massive amount of water pushing such large materials down and eventually dumping them as they ran out of steam? The Grand Canyon, if there's ever a time where they prove that those lakes truly existed, then the Grand Canyon could have possibly been carved in weeks. But there's other questions about how old rock layers are, and that is sometimes referenced radiometric dating methods. There's much that can be asked about them. There are many different ways to date rocks. There's not just one method or even one chemical to use to try to understand how old a rock is. But do you know that we've done radiometric dating on rocks or material that came from Mount St. Helens? You know that we should be able to get an accurate number, right, if supposedly it is, but whenever they did the dating on that material that exploded, they got hundreds of thousands to millions of years old, these ash deposits that came out of Mount St. Helens not too long ago. And they also did other dating of eruption that happened in New Zealand within human history and people that were eyewitnesses, and once again, hundreds of thousands to millions of years old, those dating methods were dating those rocks. They've also done such dating on recent flows in Hawaii. And what did they get for them? 3 million to 1 billion years old, it was saying that material was. In the Grand Canyon, there's actually a lava flow that flowed into the Grand Canyon at some time in the past. I believe there are even some Native Americans who say that their ancestors saw that lava flow when it flowed into the Grand Canyon. Well, they've taken tests of that lava flow and this lava layer in here underneath the Grand Canyon, and they've tested those two to say, okay, well, obviously this one should be much, much older than this more recent lava flow into the Grand Canyon, right? Well, when they did the various dating methods, majority of them pointed to saying this lava flow was older than this one that was underneath the Grand Canyon. My professor, Dave Nutting, asked a ranger about that because the ranger was giving a tour of the Grand Canyon, talking about millions of years old, and he said, well, wait a minute, why do the radiometric decay or radiometric dating methods talk about these newer flows being older than these flows that we don't know, that no one knows how old they are? And the ranger said, well, come back next year and I'll have an answer. Well, my professor came back next year, and there was the same ranger talking about millions of years, and he asked the same question. The ranger said, I remember you. Well, guess what? I did some research, and you know what I discovered? The radiometric dating doesn't work on more recent rocks. It only works on older rocks. So you're saying rocks that we know how old they are, the dating method doesn't work, but rocks that we don't know how they are, it for sure we know how old they are. That doesn't seem, that takes a lot of faith, doesn't it? To show that supposedly radiometric dating is accurate and trustworthy. You know, if Noah's flood did happen, we would expect to find millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And you know what we find? Millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Mass burial of creatures. Definitely a lot of sea creatures, such as clams like this. Here's a beautifully fossilized clam, but you know what's interesting about it? It's closed. It's closed. Well, when a clam dies, it opens up, right? And the standard idea of slow, gradual, it died, and then it was slowly buried. Well, that's not true for this one or for that one, right? No, they was buried rapidly, right, before it was able to die and then open up. And we see evidence of that in this mass burial. A bunch of clams closed because they were buried rapidly, very rapidly, not slowly and gradually, or else they would have opened up as they had died and fell down towards the bottom of the ocean. Not only do we see that for sea creatures, but even other creatures that are fossilized, such as fish. Mass burial of fish, so many together. But once again, when a fish dies, does it just go down to the bottom of the water and just be untouched until it's slowly buried? No, it's going to be eaten by other fish or just decay, right? But look at this fish. We see very little sign of decay for this fish as it was buried. And look at this fish. Beautifully, not even a scale out of place. This thing was buried rapidly to be preserved so beautifully like that. And look, here's even a palm leaf with some other fish. I don't even see any evidence of decay on the palm leaf itself. It looks very well intact, buried rapidly with those fish all at the same time. Look, here's even a fish in the middle of eating another fish when they both were buried. Rapid, catastrophic burial of creatures. We see the same for dinosaurs. You'll go to a place, you'll see dinosaurs just all jumbled together, all slammed and crammed together and fossilized. How did that happen? Something catastrophically must have buried them all together. You know, when my professor looks out and sees rock layers like this, it makes him hungry. It makes him hungry because he thinks of waffles, right? You know, you see those rock layers that once they were laid down by water, then they solidified. He thinks of waffles, you know. You've got your cinnamon waffles down here, and you got your vanilla and your chocolate, you know. They're just laid out one after the other on top of each other. You got your blueberry waffles up here. Well, what if you were to have a tree stuck in multiple layers of your pancake rock layers? Well, once again, standard evolutionary mindset, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, how did that tree just continue to remain standing as that material was slowly and gradually building up around it? This is called a polystrate fossil. Poly being many, straight being strata. It goes through many strata of rock. So here's a fossilized tree right here, going through multiple rock layers. Here's another one over there and another one over here, standing straight up, going straight through, and notice that there's no roots. It's very common for these types of polystrate fossils for trees, is that there are no roots in them, as if they were ripped up out of the ground and then stuck in these rock layers and then buried over quickly. We'll find them in different parts of the world, these polystrate fossils going through multiple rock layers. How did this tree remain undecayed as it was supposedly slowly and gradually being covered by rock layers? No, it seems like there was a catastrophic event, right, that ripped up that tree and threw it down and covered it up with multiple rock layers, all in a short amount of time. Well, what if while you were sitting down to enjoy your pancakes, suddenly the bottom pancake poked all the way through the rest, straight through the butter? That'd be pretty amazing, right? Well, we actually find geological features similar to that, where the bottom rock layer pokes all the way through multiple ones, straight through the top. Isn't that amazing? Here's one right here. And I also went and I saw some for myself. There's another one right there poking up through, and there's another one. Now, how could it have been that bottom rock layer stayed liquid enough as millions and millions of years, the next rock layers were all on top of it, and then it somehow poked through all of those, all the way to the top? No, they would have all had to have stayed very soft enough for such a thing to happen, right? That couldn't have happened by slow, gradual processes over millions of years. If the world was covered in water, and the continents weren't there to slow down the currents of the ocean, we are talking about massive destruction happening on the surface of the earth, currents upwards of 150 miles per hour in a worldwide flood. And those currents just ripping and pulverizing surfaces of the earth, scraping it off. And we actually find evidence of that. It's called the Great Unconformity. There's this layer of the earth's surface that seems to be a nice foundation, but then all of a sudden it just stops its pattern, and there's new layers that just are thrown on top of it, one right after the other, called the Great Unconformity. It just suddenly changes in this area. And once again, evidence of a global flood. Here's a picture of a piece of Shinumu quartzite, that's the lower layer, it's stuck in the middle of a Tapeats sandstone layer. There must have been something that ripped up that Shinumu quartzite and then shoved it into this Tapeats sandstone layer as it was laying it down. Otherwise, how else did that Shinumu quartzite end up in that Tapeats sandstone layer over slow, gradual processes? Speaking of that Tapeats sandstone layer, do you know how far the Tapeats sandstone layer goes? It's not just in the Grand Canyon. It extends from Mexico all the way up to northern Iceland. That's one single rock layer laid down by water. Water had to have covered that area at one point, geologists would admit. That is a very large pancake, isn't it? What a massive pancake layer. Well, when you travel to different places, sometimes there are different names given for rock layers. Like here's different names given for this limestone that are in different states. But guess what? They're all the same pancake. They were all laid down together at one time by water. Niobrara Formation, you'll find it in Colorado, much of the U.S., but it's also part of the White Cliffs of Dover and even in Israel, and that's all the same pancake layer. This is extending to different continents, all laid down by water. At one point, this same formation found in different continents. Isn't that amazing? There is evidence for Noah's flood. Some have called it the most documented biblical event. It's supported by archaeological evidence that points to this event happened in human history, and people are trying to bring it up in their writings, this worldwide flood that happened. And it's also supported by much geological evidence. There's just so much that can't happen by slow, gradual processes. It had to have been catastrophic, and we see that as we look closer, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, how much water had to have taken place in order for such formations to occur. So Noah's flood, fiction or reality? Well, looking at the evidence, I believe it's not foolish to say it's reality, that the world was covered by water at one point in its history. That you can take the Bible for what it says from the first book to the last book. But why did God send the flood to begin with? The Bible tells us that he sent it as judgment for sin, that mankind has sinned against God, and the penalty for sin is death, the wrong things we've done against him and against our fellow man. And so he sent the flood as a judgment for sin. But we see God's grace in the midst of judgment, don't we? He provided a way out, right? He provided a way out. That was building the ark. Whoever gets on the ark will be safe from God's judgment. Well, the Bible talks about another judgment that is coming, not by water, but by fire. God is going to judge the earth for sin. But just as he made a way to escape for Moses and his family, he also makes a way for mankind to escape the final judgment, and that is through faith in Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ came to earth and he died the penalty, the death we deserve, and that he offers to take our place so that we don't have to suffer God's judgment, that we can be saved from that judgment if we put our faith in him, that he, just like for Noah, will be saved by God's grace through God's way of salvation. Noah's flood in geology. Do you have any questions at this time? And if you do, raise your hand and we'll have someone come to you with a mic. And then once you have the mic, you can ask your question then.
Okay, this question is from Rick. He couldn't be here tonight, but he wanted to know, way back, Noah's Ark, did God make dinosaurs? Because he doesn't remember one being on the ark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was, were there dinosaurs on the ark? Because it doesn't specifically say so. Well, it's true, we're not told what all different types of animals were on the ark, but just that 2 of every kind came on, right? But the Bible does talk about, first of all, that God created all creatures on the same day that he created, or land animals, the same day he created man. So therefore, if dinosaurs truly existed, then they were created on day 6 as well. And if they were around during Noah's time, then 2 of every dinosaur would have also gone on the ark, just like 2 of every dog kind and 2 of every bird kind and so forth. We don't have specifically reference saying, oh, and by the way, dinosaurs were on the ark too. Yeah, you don't find that in the Bible. But if dinosaurs truly existed and they were still alive at that time, why is it unreasonable to believe that dinosaurs went on the ark? Now, some might say, well, what if the dinosaurs were trying to kill or eat the other animals? Well, lions and tigers and bears were on the ark too. So somehow God kept those animals from killing people, other animals. He could have done the same for dinosaurs. Another issue some people might have is the size of dinosaurs. Now, yes, we love the giant dinosaurs. That's captivating. It's amazing. But do you know what the average size of a mature dinosaur is? About the size of a sheep. That's about the average size of dinosaurs that we have found. The average is the size of a sheep. So it's not that he was having to take all these massive dinosaurs onto the ark, and even if he were taking some of the ones that could grow that big, he wouldn't take the old ones that were that massive. He would have taken the more younger ones, right, that were smaller, because the ones that did eventually become big, they didn't pop out of the egg, this massive already. No, they start off small, and they eventually grew their way to being the massive dinosaurs we see today. But Noah took on the ark, or God would obviously have led the dinosaurs that were more smaller of those larger types of dinosaurs. He would have led them on the ark and would have preserved them from being aggressive towards the other animals or towards Noah and his people. There's a question back there.
So, about the carbon dating stuff, how you date stuff, the two tablets that talk about the being flooding and stuff, you say that it says that they're older than the Bible. Well, was the same dating process used for those two? Could they be wrong on the dates?
I would have to look at exactly how they dated those, but it wasn't based off of carbon dating or any of those. I think there's just different stages of writing styles and techniques that we've looked throughout human history, and the etching on the stone tablets and stuff was more of an older style, especially for, I guess, ones you carry around versus the handwriting of on documents that like Moses and the Jewish people did at later points.
The Ten Commandments were put on stone.
That's true. So I'm not trying to say that was exactly the way that they dated it. I would have to look more into exactly how they date certain documents, but I believe some of that has to play a part in mankind getting eventually to the point of writing on much more malleable material, and eventually leather and then paper and so forth, that there was kind of stages of writing, so to speak. And also, when the people groups existed, the dates of the nations would also play a part in the dating of those writings of theirs, of when those nations actually existed.
You mentioned, the Bible mentions a people group that did not want to prepare themselves to go on to the ark. But were there other people groups throughout the world at that time that weren't even in that region?
The Bible isn't clear about how many nations or necessarily other people groups existed, other than we can look at the age, how long people lived, and then the kids that they were having, and then how long they lived having kids. And really, if you can live for 800 years and you can have kids for 600 of those 800 years, I mean, there is a large population on earth at that time. Now, sure, maybe some of them are killing each other. There's a lot of wickedness that's described. So people are dying, sure, but just the population rate that surged but before the flood, it's hard to know exactly how many peoples were there, but surely there were a vast majority of groups. Now, whether they were splitting off so much in the variation of nations that we see today, well, today, nations are mostly formed around culture and language. Well, the diversion of language came after the flood. So again, how much of the people groups were truly split up and different from each other, there's not as much to help us understand that. But there's definitely a large group of people, and surely people were spreading out in all places of the earth that was livable and reasonable.
So I also have another theory that there were two worldwide floods. One at the very beginning when the earth was formless. That means the whole earth was filled with water. There was no land masses, and that would be a worldwide flood. So one of my teachers once told me, there's no more water on the earth than there was from the very big creation of it, because we're in a closed system. Water can't go out of our atmosphere into the outer space. So theoretically, the same amount of water existed at the very beginning of time as it does today. So it's just God holding back the world from flooding again.
Yeah, there's different understandings of where all the water came from during the flood. I guess we had the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, so there was underwater reservoirs, which we see underwater reservoirs exist today. But we're also told that the gates of heaven, or the windows of heaven opened up and water came down. Some interpret that not to say that it was just rain, but that even during the second day of creation, where it says God separated the waters from below from the waters above, that perhaps there was this special type of water canopy that God put around the earth to make it like a greenhouse effect, which would produce vegetation to be bountiful, for people to be protected from the harmful rays of the sun, increase longevity and such forth. That when Noah's flood happened, that water canopy came down upon the earth and added to the amount of water that exists now than versus prior to the flood. So yeah, there's different theories on that. As for on creation, the first flood, I mean, a flood is usually, it was dry ground and then water came upon it. It's usually a flood, right? That it was flooded by water. But we're told that God's Spirit was moving over the waters. Well, the waters were just sitting there. It's not the waters flooded something. It just seems that God created this sphere of water, and then up comes the land at a later point. So I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a flood, but it was a sphere of water over the earth to begin with, and then we have water covering all the earth during the flood as well. So there kind of was 2 points that the earth was just a surface of water, for sure.
I was wondering, this is kind of a two-part question, but I was wondering, is there any archaeological evidence of the Ark itself? Have they found anything? And would it be feasible to go out on a limb and say that wherever the Ark did finally end up on whatever mountain, that there would be a lot. What is that?
That's just the fire alarm, don't worry.
There'd be a lot larger of a variety of different variety of animal fossils than anywhere else on the planet, because there was so much variety coming out of the Ark at that one particular time and place that would explain why maybe Africa has so many different kinds of animals, is because there was a concentration of a lot more variety. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, for that latter question, I would say a majority of the fossils came because of the result of the flood, that is, animals being rapidly buried during that catastrophic, tumultuous event. Now, fossilization does still happen today. It's much rarer and usually a slower process. So yeah, there could be more of an ability for fossilization of various creatures to be localized in that area after they got off the ark, but again, there would have to be some way that those animals are being rapidly buried after they die, which again, as many people are going hunting now.
Not fossils. Maybe not fossils, but just, I guess, old bones, is that a fossil?
No.
So maybe so maybe it would be more of a lot more of different variety of animals buried, just the bones. Has any archaeologist out there have just come up with this?
The variety was before the flood, not after.
Well, no, because I'm saying he took a lot of that variety, though, put it on the flood. So there's going to be a lot of variety after the flood, too, in that particular, wouldn't it be more concentrated at the epicenter of that's ground zero?
Well, true, but I'm sure God was working for the animals to really disperse pretty soon. Especially, he probably didn't want the deer hanging around with the lion for too long. Be like, okay, let's get some distance between y'all two and let's spread out. But yeah, I guess I can understand kind of where you're coming from, and I believe for a lot of people that do dig for bones, not necessarily fossils, and they find these bones, and even some of the ones we were looking at for the ape men, they do find these bones. They're like, oh, these bones are interesting. We don't know exactly what they are, and is this a man? Is this an ape? What is this? I'd have to look to see if there is a correlation of those unique bones being more in that area versus like the U.S. or South America or so forth. But yeah, for your first question, which was remind me of what it was again.
Have they found? Do
Oh, yeah,
I've seen
Noah's Ark.
pictures in, like, I don't know what kind of magazine it was that I think they saw. Or
Yeah,
some,
yeah. People have flown over Mount Ararat. They've flown over. They've taken pictures of what they think is the ark sticking out at certain times of the glacier melt and stuff going on there. You can take it for whatever you want. I'm not going to jump on it too much. Actually, the Bible itself doesn't say that the ark landed on top of Mount Ararat. It says it landed on the mountains of Ararat, the mountain range of Ararat. So hopefully we're not just saying it has to be just on top of that mountain up there. It's like, no, it landed somewhere along the mountain range of Ararat is what it says. So does it still exist today? I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't. It definitely isn't very well intact, probably. But are we needing to send out expeditions to try to find it? I don't know if that's necessary. There's enough evidence to support Noah's flood already. But could people find some remnants of it? Sure, I guess so. If it's been preserved in ice, just like they found those mammoths that are preserved in ice, still with food in its mouth, it's like, yeah, that can apparently be preserved pretty well. So perhaps part of Noah's Ark, if it truly was that high. Again, I don't know if God really had it go right on the peak, and it's like, oh man, it's kind of hard getting down from here. If He truly had it way up at the top, or if it was somewhere in a more safer range to truly unload all the animals and get off safely.
When you showed the fish, were there any human bones or skeletons before the flood?
Yeah, it is interesting that we do not find human bones fossilized in those deeper layers that we find some of these other creatures in. And there's various reasons given for that, and I would have to do some more research for the reasons why we don't find the human bones buried down there below. We can probably imagine that for a lot of first of all, for the fish and for the ocean creatures, I mean, there's nowhere for them to run, right? Here comes the flood, here comes the destruction. Where are you going to go? You're buried. For land animals, they're maybe not as smart. They can try to start heading to high water, but they're not fully aware of what's going on. But for mankind, when the flood, when you realize, if it potentially was raining for the first time in human history, when you realize there's something bad happening, you're able to make your way to higher ground, and you get to that higher ground so that most of the destruction and burying that's happening to begin with, you're more at the top of those layers that's happening and being preserved as long as you can until you eventually, there's no more land for you to stand on. You're on some type of raft or boat, but then, of course, you got these massive 150 current waves that are just overtaking you. You're starving to death on your raft, whatever, because it's lasting a year. You didn't have enough time to prepare food and all of your stuff. So eventually you die, and then you're floating down, and then, of course, all the fish and sharks are eating you before you even get down. So there's different reasons for why perhaps humankind weren't there at the bottom being buried so rapidly. And of course it makes sense because they would probably be the first to get up to the highest ground trying to avoid the flood that they are more aware of than the other animals, and especially the sea creatures that have no way to defend themselves from that.
Also, I was told that the Ice Age had the same results.
The results as, what were the results?
Yeah, the fish with the other fish in its mouth.
Yeah, I suppose, I suppose some things could freeze pretty quickly, or maybe encapsulate an area that then started, closing in on the creatures that couldn't escape or something like that. That some could have been preserved in that way as well.
I've been reading through Genesis, and one of the things that always, I guess, blows my mind is how long a lot of the people lived, like starting from Adam and Eve, and then going to Noah when he was starting to build the ark. He was 600 years old, and you had mentioned that after the flood, we started noticing the age, like it starts to go down. And maybe this is a question, maybe there's not quite an answer for it, but why is it that after the flood we start noticing it go down? Is it because Noah and his family, were they were starting a new generation, or was it, I don't know, what was it?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. Since it does seem to happen more dramatically after the flood, people have said, well, there must have been something that the flood did that is now causing mankind to decay faster or be more susceptible to something. And again, it goes back to that idea of this water canopy that might have existed over the earth, once again, protecting us from harmful rays, creating this kind of greenhouse effect that promotes growth and longevity. Just like for the dinosaurs, like, man, these things must have lived a long time to get this big. And not only the dinosaurs, but we even find fossils of like dragonflies with like 8 feet wingspans and cockroaches that are like 2 feet long. And we're like, man, how did these things get so big? How did they live so long? There must have been some type of environment that was different than what we have now that promoted longevity. And but after the flood, something changed, and they believe that it was that water canopy came down upon the earth. It's no longer there anymore. Thankfully, we still have some level of protection that God has from harmful rays, but we're more exposed to things that decrease our lifespan. And also we've talked about mutations as well, where we're increasing in our mutations that we're taking on from generation to generation, which also promotes bad health. So we're seeing multiple things that are decreasing the lifespan of mankind. It's rather interesting. Scientists look at cells and just the way cells are able to reproduce, and they say that mankind should be able to live forever. It should be able to just keep going and just keep going, but something makes it to start to slow down and eventually stop. And scientists are just baffled. What is that? Why does this process that just amazingly is able to just keep reproducing and reproducing and living, and then just for some reason it just starts to then slow down and stop? And they don't know why that is, but yeah, God it's part of our we brought this upon ourselves. We are suffering from our own actions, that sin is producing death and decay, things not functioning the way God originally designed them, which was for Adam to live forever, for his cells to just reproduce forever. That's how he originally designed it. But then something now is happening where it's slowing down, not working right, and then ceasing.
So we have one last question, because earlier you said starving, and I'm starving.
Yes.
And there's food back there for everybody. And it's interesting when you talk about like the sizes and the ages and stuff. Like just yesterday, I was in Puerto Vallarta for a week. I came back today, and the butterflies were like that big. And the avocados were huge. The grapefruits on the trees were massive. So, and it's very humid there. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I think the climate also is how long the people live now, and like what they eat is interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway, you get the last question since I'm starving.
Actually, one part of it's the understanding of the creation in 6,000 years, and that there are many different ways that people are saying that happened, and sort of why are they trying to change it through evolution? And I mean, of course, Satan's got a hand in that, but why are they trying to destroy the 6,000 year? If that's what you believe, and what would you believe? And then the Bible says that it's gonna all burn. And what is that gonna look like? What is your sense of what they're theorizing about that?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot in there. So there are different understandings of the 6 days of creation, that word yom, that as far as I know, for history-wise, no one was concerned about it being 24-hour days until this Darwinian evolutionary mindset really rose up saying the earth is millions and millions and millions of years old. That's like, oh no. How do we fit that millions of years into the Bible if that's true? Again, they were saying evidence, science proves millions of years. So unfortunately, Christians seem to be panicked and saying, we have to agree with science or else we'll look foolish. So let's take science and shove it into the Bible. How's it going to fit? Oh, that word day, yom, could mean a period of time. A period of time. Oh, well then we'll say that it was a long period of time that God created over those 6 days of creation. Well, context usually helps you understand what a word means, right? Like the word trunk. If you say, I hid the key in the trunk, you might say, well, did you hide it in the trunk of the elephant? Did you hide it in the car trunk? Did you hide it in the trunk of the tree? Right? There's so many different meanings that the word trunk can mean, but once you add other words in, you understand, oh, now I know what that word means. And in Genesis, God seems to have given us ample reason to believe that these are 24-hour days, such as at the end of a day, what would he say? There was evening and there was morning, the first day. Evening and morning, why would he mention that if it's supposedly thousands of years? And also he starts numbering them off, doesn't he? First day, second day, third day. Those contexts seem to show this is a 24-hour period. And I feel like the solid reasoning that I stand on that is because in the Ten Commandments, when God says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, he then goes on to say, just as in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and everything in them and rested on the seventh, so too should you work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. Well, what's he saying there? Just as God worked for 6 long periods of time, you, mankind, should work for 6 long periods. No, that's not what he's saying, is he? No, just as God created in 6 24-hour days, you, man, shall work for 6 24-hour days and rest for the seventh. You know, God could have created everything in one day, right? But he chose 6 days and rested on the seventh. Why? For us to learn from, right? For us to say, he's giving us a model for us to follow, that we work for 6 days and we should rest on the seventh. That's healthy for us to do. That's how he's designed us to function. And so I feel like that's the proper interpretation of the 6 days of creation, 24-hour periods. As for, remind me of your next question after that.
What's your sense of the burning of the earth?
Well, I guess I just take what God describes in the book of Revelation of just terrible climactic situations happening on earth that's destroying earth, and then eventually he says, or John says, that the old earth passes away. So it's just completely done away with, whether he burns it up first completely and then casts it away, whatever that looks like, it's not super clear. But obviously it's completely destroyed and done away with, and then it says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. So he creates a whole new earth. It's not the old earth, just kind of reformed and let's redo. No, he's totally done away with the old earth, and he's recreated a whole new one. And so, yeah, that old earth, or this earth that we're on, is going to be completely destroyed. Kind of a gradual process during the end times, gradual but very climactic at the end times, but then eventually it'll just be completely burned up and done away with, cast out, completely purged of all evil and sin and corruption. Thank you for your time this evening. I know we went a little bit over, but I'll do the last drawings. Thank you once again. How about I end in prayer? Heavenly Father, we are so thankful that you have not left us without revealing your handiwork, revealing who you are, as the creator of so much amazing design all around us, but also you've left us with the evidence of the judgment you sent upon earth during Noah's flood, and that you still put your rainbow in the sky, Lord, to remind us that you will never destroy the earth by water again, but you have told us that another judgment is coming. But that, Lord, just as you showed grace to Noah and his family, you have extended grace to all mankind to make a way to be saved from the judgment we deserve for our wrongdoing through Jesus Christ and the penalty he took upon himself that we deserved. Lord, may we be thankful that you are a God of grace and seek to make you known to those around us so they can put their hope in you as well. And Lord, help us to share the truth in love. We're not here to win arguments or make people feel foolish for what they believe, but we want to reveal who you are and the hope that you give mankind. Help us to do that in a way that is effective for your glory and for man's benefit. In Jesus' name, amen.